Who could that be? Hello?
Jill, are you okay?
Brad, is that you?
Listen, you gotta get out of there.
What are you talking about?
I don't have time to explain. You gotta get out of there right now.
All right, let me grab my...
The more things change, the more they stay the same. Now that some time has passed since its release, it's the perfect time to revisit Resident Evil 3 with a critical eye and discover how history has repeated itself over 20 years later. We're going to be going over some minor spoilers in terms of locations and story beats, so if you haven't already, we'll advise that you play through Resident Evil 3 before watching this video. If, however, you've already beaten the Resident Evil 3 remake, or you just want to know more about it and don't care about spoilers, then stay tuned as we're about to enter the world of survival horror again.
Hey, Captain. This fine young lady could use our help.
Carlos, you didn't even think to ask fine young lady her name? She is an elite operative of RPD, Special Tactics and Rescue Service. Her name is something Valentine.
It's Jill.
Those looking for a direct sequel to Resident Evil 2 will get it in name, but won't get the same creepy, dark, foreboding atmosphere that the 2019 remake gave players. Instead, you'll get that in small spots, but RE3, much like the original actually, puts the emphasis heavily on the action. It won't take long before you have enough ammo and weapons to be your own one-person army, and with the number of enemies later on in the game, you're going to need it. Well, there's no scientific maths behind this stat, but at a guess, I'd imagine that for every zombie you gun down in RE2, you'll be downing at least 5 here in RE3. Just like the original games that released back in 1998 and 99, RE3 goes in a different direction to its prequel, and perhaps, as a result, is shorter. But we'll come back to that a little bit later.
Right. Big, warm RPD welcome.
How did he find me?
Calling 2020's Resident Evil 3 a remake is stretching it somewhat. While the beginning and the end of the journey largely remain the same, the journey there is vastly different. Gone is the Gravedigger boss fight, most of the puzzles, the clock tower, graveyard and the city hall locations. Also, not to mention there's no live selections either, and there's also a few alterings to the story which sees Carlos go to the RPD instead of Jill, which means that the big guy doesn't get to visit it.
Jill!
Brad!
We've gotta... Jill! Help! No!
On the surface it sounds like a lot, and well it is. The old Resident Evil 3 had its limbs chewed off and replaced following some Frankenstein-like surgery. Resident Evil 3 2020 is far less of a remake than its prequel Resident Evil 2 got in 2019. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Well, yes and no to answer my own question. It really does depend on your own personal viewpoint coming in. If you were longing to see the clock tower in glorious HD, and perhaps eager to relive the Nemesis and Jill fight that took place outside the RPD, then yeah, you're going to be disappointed. However, this reimagining has added a number of extra beats to the story and areas to explore, many of which are actually wonderful additions. It should be no surprise that one of the new features compared to the original is an over-the-shoulder viewpoint third-person camera, as opposed to the original fixed camera setting. The fixed camera, of course, has been gone for some time now, and players have grown accustomed to this third-person viewpoint, a way of playing that in no way diminishes the survival horror aspect of the game. The game gives you complete control, but not enough to allow you to peek around corners to see what's lurking before you should be able to. Both Jill and Carlos have been given a rather interesting dodge mechanic. Pressing R1 or RT on the Xbox at the right moment will see Jill dodge enemy attacks and allow for time to slow down to the point where she can get in a lethal shot. While you might want to call a mechanic like this bullet time, the Resident Evil community have lovingly dubbed it Valentine, and I can't argue with that. I think it's perfect. Carlos' version is slightly different as he opts for just punching his foe whatever body part is in his face at the time. Satisfying against zombies, but it looks a little bit strange against tougher foes like the Hunters. One other change is that unlike the RE2 remake where your knife would have its own life bar, in RE3 your knife is invincible. However, you can now no longer stab zombies to get them off you quickly, instead you just have to mash that button in order to survive. Ever since her unwanted vacation in the Arklay Mountains, Jill has always been one of Resident Evil's best characters. Her no-nonsense approach to much of what's happening around her is a welcome one, and one of the best parts of 2020's Resident Evil 3 is Jill's one-liners, many of which will be reused for years to come on social media and internet message boards, with most people never knowing the origins.
It's my turn, bitch!
Bitch can't even swim.
But it's no zombie. It knows what it wants and won't stop till it gets it. Don't you like that in a man?
No thanks. He's all yours.
I'm not gonna die on you, leave you in a cold, cruel, Carlosless world.
Okay.
Not to be outdone, Carlos also has a few of his own.
Hey, easy, lady. I got you.
Who are you? What are you doing?
Name's Carlos, and I'm saving you. All right, you want me to keep out? I'll keep out. Now here's a weird fucking door.
Leave it. We're here for Bard.
One at a time, take a number. Man, it sucks to be popular.
Carlos' role has been expanded when compared to the original game. As we mentioned earlier,
Where'd that
Carlos
cop
is now
go?
the one who goes into the RPD with UBCS teammate Tyrell, and later on, the hospital, where he's looking for a vaccine to the T-virus in order to save Jill. In fact, the addition of the hospital section is one that I absolutely loved, and is perhaps the only part of the game where it turns into true survival horror once more. It has everything: dimly lit corridors, creepy jump scares, a heightened sense of insecurity, and blood splattered absolutely everywhere. It's creepy, it's intense, and it's by far my favourite part of the game, especially as you can explore it with both Carlos and Jill to find their own unique rewards. It would have been nice if it had been a bit longer, but the hospital section in RE3 is easily one of my favourite parts of the whole franchise now. One aspect of RE3 2020 that has been difficult to avoid is the game's actual length, which, in truth, is not long at all. For a first time run, you're looking at between 5 to 6 hours if you take your time and take everything in. After that, your runs will quickly decrease to 2 to 3 hours, but while that sounds short, this is the first Resident Evil game where I've actively gone back to lower my times. The game's focus on action really plays into its replayability, and with tasks that unlock points that you can spend in a shop for some helpful items, there's no feeling quite like going back on a harder difficulty with an infinite rocket launcher and unloading on enemies that gave you trouble before, again and again and again. Yep, take that, Nemi. In truth, the Nightmare and Inferno difficulties would normally be too hard for me, but with the helpful items I've unlocked, I too can feel impressed by blasting through Resident Evil in just over an hour. Although I must say, seeing current speedrunners going through the infernal difficulty at an hour without any shop items at all is highly impressive. But it's proof that the game lets you play how you want. It gives you options. It's not as restrictive as, say, a Bloodborne or a Dark Souls, where it's hard, and if you're not good enough, then tough.
Fucker's still alive. I can't stay here.
While Jill and Carlos have impressive roles throughout the game, what about our leading star, Nemesis? His role in the remake has been vastly reduced in the entire game, and there's only really one section where he stalks you, in vast contrast to the original, where he was an almost constant menace throughout the entire game. Nemesis' role is reduced somewhat to cutscenes and boss fights after the first hour, and while his impact on the story and his menacing status isn't diminished, it is disappointing, especially after Mr. X's triumph and return in the RE2 remake. Many, myself included, were hoping for a faster and more terrifying version of Mr. X, but it's just not happened. Perhaps Capcom discovered through playtests that a constant nemesis just wouldn't have been fun these days, but we'll never know. Nemi's still here, still mean and still terrifying, but just not as foreboding as he was in the original.
Get off my train, shitbird!
Resident Evil 3, despite its short length, is fun to play, and in a gaming landscape that is filled with open world titles with not really much to see or do, we have to be grateful for games like this and that they offer something a little bit different. When it comes to comparing the RE3 remake with the RE2 one, then the story is the same as it ever was. The Resident Evil 2 remake is the better game, just as it was way back in the late 90s, but don't discount RE3. It's different. It's not a sequel with more bells and whistles, it's its own unique thing with a slightly different take on the same world, and for that, I'm glad that it exists. Sure, it's short and is more action orientated, but, and this is the crucial part, it's fun to play. What happens next is anyone's guess. The right step would be a full remake of Code Veronica, a game that always seems to be forgotten about when it comes to the Resident Evil series, and considering the changes made to 2 and 3 on the remakes, it'd be really interesting to see how they would handle a Code Veronica remake, or what we should probably say is reimagining, especially when you think about the Ashford twins. Now that would be an interesting one.